Hello, welcome, or the Historian Channel. Leave your like. So let's go. The United States of America was born from the desire of many people who had traveled there from the old world of Europe to free themselves from the imperial powers that had dominated them for centuries, and to have democracy, freedom, justice for all, and to take command of your own destiny. The birth of the American nation was painful. First, because they had to fight against the forces of the British, and then, against the indigenous peoples of North America, inside and outside the new borders they had declared. Among the many conflicts, the new nation had to establish its own laws, political system, and culture. None of this developed overnight, obviously. There would not always be a consensus throughout the century after 1776, when the United States of America was born, as it grew under a political union of states that comprised it. It also saw the widening of a cultural divide between the industrial states of the North and the agricultural states of the South. Perhaps more than anything else, the two sides of this divide found themselves at odds over the issue of slavery. The ethics of owning a person as property became a legal battle between those who supported the practice and those who opposed it. In American society, the United States of America was born in 1936. This dispute has become a battlefield. More Americans died in the American Civil War, which raged across the North American continent between 1861 and 1865, than in any other war in which Americans fought throughout their history. And while the battles raged for a long time, the ramifications of the Civil War continue to be felt to this day in America over issues such as culture and race. Today, we delve into the darkest chapter in American history. Welcome to Wars of the World, the debate over slavery in America. In fact, it predates the Declaration of Independence itself. Under British rule, the American territories were divided into 13 colonies, and in one of these colonies, Rhode Island, laws were passed in 1774, making slavery illegal within its state limits. However, although many were sympathetic to the call for the abolition of slavery, after 1776 slaves were still an important factor in the economies of many states, particularly in the South, where the main export was tobacco, and the use of slaves to harvest tobacco was seen as simply part of the natural order of things. This would change after April 1793, when American inventor Eli Whitney built the first cotton gin, a machine that quickly and easily separated cotton fibers from their seeds, allowing for much higher productivity than previous manual methods. The invention of the cotton gin had a major impact on the course of history. In addition to the production of cotton-based goods, in many ways, it was a somewhat humble spark that would eventually ignite civil war. The cotton gin boosted the profitability of the cotton trade, generating great fortunes for the landowners involved, especially in the South. American cotton became highly sought after not only in its own country, but throughout the world, especially in the lucrative British, making it a key American export. Port cities such as New Orleans, Louisiana, and Charleston, South Carolina, became major centers of commerce, growing in size and wealth. An important factor in achieving this profitability was the use of slaves acquired from Africa to work in the cotton fields. However, in the more northern states, the economy was being driven more by advances made in industrialization and manufacturing. Just like the cotton fields of the South, the industry of the North required large numbers of people to power it. But rather than importing slaves, labor was acquired through large numbers of immigrants, particularly from places like Ireland, where a large percentage of the population felt oppressed by the British Crown. Therefore, as the immigrant population in the North grew seeking freedom, so did their calls for the total abolition of slavery. Meanwhile, America expanded, largely absorbing the territory to the west. On April 30, 1803, the vast expanse of land stretching from the Gulf of Mexico to the Pacific was acquired by the United States from France for over $11 million, in what history now remembers as the Louisiana Purchase. This presented a problem as to whether these new territories would utilize slaves like the South or be called free states like the North. On January 1, 1808, the abolitionist movement won a key victory when the United States federal government banned the importation of new slaves from Africa. Consequently, in the northern states, slavery was gradually eliminated. But for the southern states, this was unthinkable, and the ban on new slave imports threatened to restrict their cotton industry, which was still expanding and depended heavily on slavery. The need for new slaves in the South would result in an increase in the international slave trade in America. Between the North and the South, rising abolitionism also reinforced the cultural separation between the two sides of the debate, something that was exacerbated by the number of immigrants now in the North. This led many Southern white families, who valued their history and the birth of their nation, to consider themselves the most American states as new states were formed after the Louisiana Purchase. A delicate political balance between North and South was maintained, admitting both sides into the United States. However, the North had a significantly larger population than the South, many of whom wanted to abolish slavery throughout the United States. And so, the North came to dominate the political landscape within the Chamber of Representatives. Feeling threatened by this, the South sought to redress the balance in 1819, when Maine and Missouri petitioned for admission to the Union. The status of slaves in prospective states became a topic of debate and could influence future states. After much deliberation, it was decided that Missouri would be admitted as a slave state and Maine as a free state, thus maintaining the political balance between both sides of the debate. This became known as the Missouri Compromise and stated that in the future, states north of the 36 degrees 30 minutes latitude line would only be admitted if they had abolished slavery. Although the compromise was just that, many observers at the time noted that the issue of slavery had divided the nation and there did not appear to be a long-term solution that would satisfy either side, especially since Southern cotton exports were still growing, as were your profits. Meanwhile, tensions with neighboring Mexico, whose borders encompassed the present-day U.S. states of Texas and California, began to rise. In 1836, Texas seceded from Mexico, declaring itself an independent republic, but this resulted in both Mexicans and Americans expressing ambitions to absorb the new country into their own nations. In 1843, American President John Tyler, aiming for re-election, decided to officially annex Texas to his politics. This was to overcome the suspect diplomacy of British efforts to free slaves in Texas, which he said would undermine slavery in the United States. Tyler diplomats held secret negotiations with the Texian government in Houston, securing a treaty of annexation in April 1844. When the documents were submitted to the United States Senate for ratification, the details of the terms of the annexation became public and the question of acquisition of Texas rose to prominence in the 1844 presidential election, which was won by James K. Polk, a supporter of the annexation of Texas. It was during his tenure, on February 19, 1846, that Texas became the 28th state. This sparked the two-year Mexican-American War. This war was a milestone in American history. It consolidated America as a military power on the North American continent. Second, the acquisition of formerly Mexican territory reinforced the prevailing idea of America's manifest destiny, a widely held belief among the people of the United States that its population was destined by God to expand across the North American continent, bringing law, order, American institutions, and Christianity to the vast frontier. But while the war itself helped to unify some of the divisions in American society, it was in the peace that followed that divisions, particularly around slavery, not only resurfaced but festered. The effects now reached the Pacific Ocean, and the issue of slavery in the new territories was debated. Both the North and South held to their respective views and wanted to impose those views on Texas. Before the end of the war, Pennsylvania Congressman David Wilmot suggested to the House of Representatives that it ban slavery in the new American territories, dubbed the Wilmot Proviso. He was eventually defeated, but the debate continued over what to do with the new territories and why. In an attempt to address the divide between the free states and the slave states, a package of 5 separate bills was passed by the United States Congress in September 1850, dubbed the Compromise of 1850. Under this compromise, California was admitted in the United States as a free state, while the remaining parts of the former Mexican land were organized into the territories of New Mexico and Utah. The decision regarding slavery in these states should be determined under the concept of popular sovereignty, in which the people of each territory would decide whether slavery would be permitted or not. The compromise also included the Fugitive Slave Act, which prevented the United States Congress from interfering in the interstate slave trade and allowed Southern slave owners to take free black people from the North and transport them to the South. If this did not enrage Northern abolitionists enough, the act also made it a crime for those in the North to help slaves escape their masters in the South. The Compromise of 1850, although it seemed to resolve the dispute in the corridors of power, only further inflamed Northern abolitionists, who now felt they were being forced to aid slavery in the South. The debate intensified on January 4, 1854, when Democrat Stephen A. Douglas proposed a bill to ordain the Nebraska Territory in order to bring the area under civilian control and allow the construction of a transcontinental railroad through the territory. However, Southern senators opposed this because the region was north of the 36 degrees 30 minutes latitude stipulated in the Missouri Compromise of 1820, which meant that Nebraska would become a free state. This threatened to upset the political balance between the free and slave states in favor of the former. Therefore, to gain the support of Southern senators, Douglas proposed the creation of two territories in the area, called Nebraska and Kansas, and the repeal of the Missouri Compromise line on the issue of slavery. It was decided once again to leave the decision to the people who would actually live there, under the policy of popular sovereignty. It was assumed that the northernmost territory, Nebraska, would oppose slavery, while the southern state, Kansas, would allow it, thus maintaining balance. Unfortunately, some of the more aggressive elements on both sides of the debate wanted to ensure that Kansas adopted their way of thinking and flooded into new territory to bolster their side's numbers and influence the final vote. Opposing factions were formed, and inevitably this led to violence. In late 1855, more than 1,000 people from the slave state of Missouri crossed the border into Kansas and attacked the abolitionist town of Lawrence, which was eventually sacked by them a few months later. In response to these attacks, one of the most radical abolitionists, a man named John Brown, organized the murder of 5 supposedly pro-slavery settlers along the Pottawatomie Creek. There then followed about 4 months of violence between small armed groups throughout eastern Kansas, including a small force led by John Brown, building on the reputation of his attack on the 5 settlers. This period became known as Bloody Kansas, and in late 1856, federal troops had to be called in to restore order before the people of Kansas voted to become a free state. But the violence continued for years afterward, albeit more sporadically than in 1856. Blood was spilled over the slavery debate, and for extremists like John Brown, there was no turning back. In 1857, abolitionists suffered a setback with the case of Dred Scott, a slave taken by his owner to Illinois and then to Wisconsin, both free places. Scott therefore argued that being in these areas where slavery had been abolished, he was now free. The Supreme Court, with 9 judges called to judge the case, had 6 supporting slavery. Consequently, the court ruled that blacks were not citizens under the United States Constitution of 1787. This ruling infuriated abolitionists as trouble in Kansas began to erupt. A new political party was founded that would have a dramatic impact on American politics forever. The Grand Old Party, better known to history as the Republican Party, was founded on March 20, 1854. In addition to promoting classical liberalism and economic reforms, it was predominantly made up of abolitionists who wanted to end slavery throughout the Union. Among the members of the new party was one Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln came from Kentucky and grew up on the frontier, in a poor family who lived in a one-room cabin. However, he was a determined man. After essentially providing his own education, he became a lawyer, a remarkable feat. However, he soon found his way into politics, joining the Whig Party, a predecessor to the Republican Party, eventually rising to the positions of party leader, Illinois state legislator, and congressman. In 1849, he decided to abandon government and resume law practice, but he was angered by the Democratic Party's success in opening the prairie lands to slavery, and so returned to politics in 1854. Initially, he resisted recruitment into the new Republican Party, preferring to deal with divisions in his Whig Party. However, he gradually aligned himself more with the Republicans, appearing more committed to abolishing slavery than the older party. Between August and October 1858, Lincoln held several debates. He with Democrat Stephen A. Douglas in the Senate campaign, his speeches and debates would be disseminated beyond Illinois and came to symbolize the problems of slavery in the United States. Although Lincoln lost the election to Douglas, much of what he said in the debates went on to shape his presidential campaign in 1860, and he was cemented as a champion of the anti-slavery movement. But the call for the total abolition of slavery, whether through peaceful or political means, was taking too long for some. While holding a meeting with his followers in the free black community of Chatham, Ontario, Canada, in the winter of 1858, extremist John Brown proposed inspiring and equipping a slave insurrection in Northern Virginia. Growing frustration with the failure to achieve the peaceful emancipation of slaves in the South made many abolitionists, including the most peaceful ones, receptive to Brown's violent suggestion. Those who were not active members supported him through weapons, supplies, money, or intelligence. Early the next year, 1859, Brown and his supporters rented a farm near Harper's Ferry, Virginia, which they used for their planned attack on the nearby federal arsenal. On October 16th, Brown and his 21 followers occupied the U.S. federal capital, carrying out their audacious plan to obtain weapons for their black insurrection. However, the plan soon fell apart, and he was quickly surrounded by the Virginia militia, commanded by Colonel Robert E. Lee. In the ensuing fight, Brown's men were overpowered, with 10 being killed in the exchange of fire, while the Brown himself was wounded and captured. Brown was tried for treason, but endeared himself to abolitionists as a martyr as he made an impassioned defense of his actions. He was found guilty and hanged on December 2, 1859. But the consequences of the attack were far-reaching and highly damaging to the political status, particularly in the South, where fears of a Northern-backed slave revolt were fueled almost out of control. Many Southern slave owners began to suspect that the North would never allow them to keep their slaves, and this left them questioning their future in the Union of States. In 1860, the people of the United States were preparing to go to the polls, but behind the usual pompous exterior of a presidential campaign, the many states that made up the Union were more divided than ever, with the Democratic Party itself being divided between the Northern and Southern lines after the recent problems with slavery. Against this backdrop, the audacious new Republican Party presented Abraham Lincoln as its presidential candidate. On Election Day, Lincoln won just over 1 million votes, less than 40% of the total, but significantly gained a majority in the Electoral College with 180 electoral votes. It swept across the North, as well as the Pacific Coast states of California and Oregon. His victory shook the pro-slavery South, as Lincoln was seen as something of a figurehead for the American abolitionist movement at the time. However, Lincoln knew he could not simply make slavery illegal, given the Union's sensitivity on the issue, and so he promised not to interfere with the practice in the South in an attempt to appease them. It was not to be. Lincoln's election further alienated the South, where he did not win a single vote. On December 17, 1860, a convention was held in South Carolina, which was the wealthiest state in the Union, to revoke the state's ratification of the United States Constitution. In doing so, on December 20th, South Carolina left the United States of America. The secession of South Carolina deeply impacted Lincoln and caused a domino effect on other Southern states, which felt threatened by the Republican Party's presidency, leading several of them to follow suit. Within weeks, Mississippi ceded on January 9, 1861, followed by Florida on January 10 and Alabama the next day. Georgia seceded on January 19 and Louisiana joined the secessionist states on January 26. On February 4, representatives of the secessionist states met in Montgomery, Alabama, forming a provisional coalition to create their own national government. They named their new political alliance the Confederate States of America, adopted their own flag and days. Of course, here is the rewritten text with proper formatting and punctuation. Then, they chose Jefferson Davis as president. Texas would be the last state to join the Confederacy, seceding from the Union on February 23, the second time the state was absorbed by a neighboring power in just 16 years. President Lincoln had barely taken office and was already facing the greatest crisis in the country's history. Hoping to resolve the crisis peacefully at his inauguration as President of the United States on March 4, 1861, he said, "There appears to be an apprehension among the people of the Southern states that, with the rise of a Republican administration, their property and their peace and personal safety are in danger. There has never been any reasonable ground for such apprehension. Indeed, the most ample evidence to the contrary has always existed and been open to your inspection. I only quote one of these speeches when I declare that I have no intention directly or indirectly of interfering with the institution of slavery in the states where it exists." Unfortunately, by this time, the situation had completely gotten out of control. At Fort Sumter, Located on an island in the South Carolina harbor, United States troops faced a standoff with local militia. After the state seceded from the Union, when President Lincoln announced his intention to resupply the fort, Confederate General Pierre Gustave Toutant Beauregard ordered his men to attack it on April 12, 1861. After 34 hours of exchanging artillery fire between the on both sides, Southern Army Major Robert Anderson, who was in command of the fort along with 80 of his men, surrendered. The American Civil War had begun. On April 15, 1861, President Lincoln issued orders that an army of 75,000 men from states loyal to the Union be raised and sent to what he referred to as an insurrection in the South. The outbreak of hostilities and Lincoln's call to arms forced states to choose sides, and as a result, Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina chose to join forces. The Confederacy, despite its growth with the addition of these states, had several major disadvantages in a long war against the Union. The Union had a much larger population than the Confederacy. In 1861, the Confederacy had about 9.5 million people, including approximately 3.5 million slaves. To put this into a modern perspective, the population of New York alone was 8.5 million. However, Confederate forces had to protect more than 770,000 square miles of land even before the final 4 states joined. After the war began, in contrast, the Union had a population in the region of 18.5 million and would amass a force that peaked at 2.2 million soldiers, compared to the Confederacy's approximately 1 million troops. If it wasn't difficult enough for the Confederacy, the more industrialized Union had thousands of extra miles of train tracks, allowing it to relocate and supply troops more quickly. The outbreak of hostilities also severely damaged their cotton industry, as not only were many workers called to fight, but Lincoln ordered the Union Navy to blockade major Confederate ports. The Confederacy quickly relocated and supplied its troops. President Jefferson Davis fought to maintain unity among the states of the Confederacy. After all, they had left the Union to maintain their individual rights, and so there was a prevailing feeling among them that the needs of their own states came first, whatever those may be. Thus, when the two sides marched against each other for the first major battle of the American Civil War, many felt that it would only be a matter of months until a Union victory or, at least, some peace agreement. With Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina on the side of the Confederacy, on May 3rd, President Lincoln again expanded the Union Army with a call for 43,000 more volunteers. On May 24th, Union forces crossed the Potomac River and occupied Arlington Heights, Virginia, which was the home of former U.S. Army Colonel Robert E. Lee, who commanded the force that they captured Jameson, Virginia. On May 24th, Union forces crossed the Potomac River, occupied Arlington Heights, captured Jameson, Virginia, and also took Alexandria, a neighboring city. While there, Union Colonel Elmer Ellsworth, commander of the 11th New York Infantry and a close personal friend of President Lincoln, went to remove a large Confederate flag from the Marshall House, and in run by a devout successor, James W. Jackson. Jackson shot Ellsworth, a Union officer, in Arlington Heights as he was coming down from the roof after removing the flag, hitting him in the chest. One of Ellsworth's men fired back at Jackson, hitting him in the face and killing him, but it was too late for Ellsworth, who died from his wounds. In doing so, Ellsworth became the first Union officer killed in the Civil War. Both men became martyrs for their causes. With Ellsworth's body displayed at the White House before burial on June 3rd, more than a week later, the Confederate and Union armies would have their first clash. Early in the morning, after an exhausting march through a rainstorm, 2 columns of Union forces, numbering 3,000 men under the command of Colonel Kelly and Colonel Dement, attacked 800 poorly armed Confederate recruits under the command of Colonel George Porterfield in Philippi, Virginia. After a brief exchange of fire, the Confederate troops retreated. The battle fueled more protests in Western Virginia against secession. A few days later, in Wheeling, the Wheeling Convention overturned Virginia's ordinance of secession and appointed Francis H. Pierpont as the first governor of the state of West Virginia, accepted as the 35th state of the Union years later, on January 20, 1863. After this success, the people of the North felt assured of a quick victory. President Lincoln directed General Irving McDowell to organize an offensive to defeat the Confederates and open the way to Richmond, aiming to capture the city before the next Confederate command. Lincoln ordered a Confederate attack on the city where Congress would meet, aiming to hasten the end of the war. The offensive would focus on an attack on more than 20,000 troops. According to Union witnesses, Lyon was killed by a soldier named John Morgan, who shot him with an old cavalry pistol after Lyon threw a rock at him as he approached. Lyon's death was a significant blow to the Union, making him the first general to be killed in the war. The Battle of Wilson's Creek was a brutal fight that saw Union forces compelled to retreat. Despite the loss of Lyon, the Union continued its efforts to stem the Confederate advance. Meanwhile, in Virginia, after the Battle of Bull Run, the Confederates, led by Johnston and Jackson, consolidated their position and strengthened their resolve to fight for the independence of the Southern states. The American Civil War had begun with a series of bloody and decisive clashes, showing that it would be a prolonged and challenging conflict for both parties. The consequences of each battle would echo through the years, shaping the destiny of the American nation and leaving a lasting legacy in the country's history. He refused to surrender like so many others. Lyon became yet another martyr for the Union. He would enjoy victory again, however, on August 28, when his naval forces attacked the newly completed Forts Clark and Hatteras at Cape Hatteras, North Carolina. 880 men of the 9th and 10th New York Volunteers landed on the coast at night in small boats. The Confederates abandoned Fort Clark to withdraw and await reinforcements, after which they could retake the fort, but they never arrived. After a heavy bombardment by Union warships, from which more than 3,000 shells were fired in 3 hours, the Confederates surrendered. It was the beginning of the Union campaign to close Confederate ports and strangle their vital cotton trade. At the beginning of the Civil War, the Confederate government quickly began a diplomatic campaign to obtain essential war materials from Great Britain and France, aiming to balance its industrial imbalance with the North. In November 1861, the British ship RMS Trent left Havana, Cuba, with 2 Confederate commissioners, James M. Mason and John Slidell, on board, taking them to London. The 2 Confederates, after a long journey avoiding Union forces to reach Cuba, found their luck ended when the Trent was intercepted in the Bahamas Channel by the U.S. warship San Jacinto, under the command of Captain Charles Wilkes. Acting without official instructions, Wilkes forcibly removed the 2 commissioners and interned them at Fort Warren in Boston. Despite praise in the North, the seizure aboard a British ship violated previous agreements, resulting in the ire of the British government. With the outbreak of the Civil War, the British adopted the official position that the Civil War was a strictly internal matter for the American people. However, Britain was extremely dependent on cotton produced by the Confederate States for its textile industry, and therefore it was in their interest to keep the supply line open. However, the U.S. accused Britain of alliance with the Confederacy, an act that Union diplomats warned would lead to war. The British mounted a vigorous response, threatening war with the Union if the men were not returned to British custody. The British government. He went so far as to convene a special cabinet committee to make preparations for war, ordering reinforcements for Canada and sending Royal Navy warships to North American waters. They also stopped the sale of saltpeter vital for gunpowder manufacture to foreign countries, anticipating that British forces would need it in the coming months. Fortunately, tempers calmed down and a diplomatic agreement prevented war between Great Britain and the Union. Mason and Slidell were freed in 1862, and despite official British neutrality, local shipyards built ships for the Confederate Navy, aware that they would be armed and used as warships after leaving British waters. Back on land on October 21, 1861, some 1,700 Union troops encountered an equal number of Confederates at the Battle of Ball's Bluff in Virginia. Union Colonel Edward D. Baker, a senator from Oregon and friend of President Lincoln, led troops across the Potomac River, but was forced to retreat and was eventually killed on the riverbank. At night, Confederate reinforcements arrived, forcing the Union to retreat back across the river, in which many Union soldiers drowned. These overwhelming successes at the start of the war had been a series of disasters for Lincoln and the Union. The new year brought a new wave of battles between the Union and the Confederates, beginning in Kentucky, a state that declared itself neutral at the start of the war. However, the Confederate Army disregarded his declaration, sending troops into the state on September 3, 1861, which prompted the Union to send troops under the command of Brigadier General Ulysses S. Grant. On January 10, 1862, two opposing forces of just over 2,000 men each met at the Battle of Middle Creek, which ended in a Union victory. On January 19, 1862, the two sides met at the Battle of Mill Springs. Although the Confederates had marginal numerical superiority, they were poorly equipped and, having marched through a rainy night, were exhausted. Union forces managed to outflank them, and the Confederates were forced to retreat. Most of the blame for their defeat fell on Major General George B. Crittenden. He was accused of being drunk on duty during the course of the battle. The battles of Middle Creek and Mill Springs consolidated Union control in eastern Kentucky and allowed them to take the war to Tennessee in February. There, on February 6th, the Union forced the Confederate contingent at Fort Henry to surrender. Faced with a combination of violence and the fort's poor location on the Tennessee River, nearly flooded by rising water levels, the fort's surrender opened the Tennessee River to Union ships. To the south, on the Alabama border, after the battle between February 6th and 12th, the Union carried out a series of raids using ironclad boats to destroy Confederate shipping and railroad bridges along the river. On February 16th, General Ulysses S. Grant captured Fort Donelson, another important landmark along the river. He would famously engrave the words, "Fort Donelson will here be marked in capital letters on the maps of our united country." Against this apparent reversal of fortunes compared to the opening rounds of the war, the Confederate States of America inaugurated Jefferson Davis as their president on February 22, 1862. More successes for the Union would follow in the next month. On March 7, 1862, more than 20,000 soldiers fought in the Battle of Pea Ridge, Missouri, which would prove to be the most crucial battle of the war west of the Mississippi River. Union forces, commanded by Brigadier General Samuel R. Curtis, advanced south from central Missouri, forcing Confederate forces into northwestern Arkansas. The Confederates counterattacked, hoping to recapture northern Arkansas and Missouri, but Curtis withstood the attack on the first day and forced them to retreat the next. Despite the Confederates' numerical superiority, the victory secured the state for the Union and allowed them to challenge Confederate forces in Arkansas. While the fighting on land resembled countless battles fought decades earlier and around the world, at sea and along North American rivers, the warships used by the Union and the Confederacy were conventional ships. In the midst of a great technological revolution, although sail was still the primary means of propulsion, it was quickly being supported by steam engines, which would have been used to keep a ship mobile even if the mast had been knocked down, which would have disabled ships that they depended only on candles. The power of steam allowed ships to leave their ports without dependence on a favorable wind. Just as revolutionary was the addition of new armor and weaponry to the ships. In the 1820s, navies adopted cannons that fired explosive shells instead of the conventional cannonball. The damage these weapons would cause to wooden vessels was immense, leading navies around the world to begin covering their ships with iron armor, giving rise to the term battleship. In the Crimean War, the French effectively utilized floating ironclad gun batteries that absorbed much punishment while silencing Russian forts. In 1856, they launched the first ironclad warship, the Glory. Work on an ironclad warship in the United States begun in 1854 was frequently postponed. After the Confederate States seceded, they began work on converting the old USS Merrimack into a battleship and renamed her the CSS Virginia. The Union, fearing the ship's potential damage, accelerated construction of its own, naming it the USS Monitor in response to Virginia. The Monitor did not look like any other ship of the time, having a hull that did not extend far out of the water, making the deck very wet in rough weather. The Monitor's most prominent feature was that it housed its main armament, a pair of 280mm cannons, in a rotating turret that gave it a wide arc of fire compared to conventional turrets. He was accused of being drunk on duty during the course of the battle. The battles of Middle Creek and Mill Springs consolidated Union control in eastern Kentucky and allowed them to take the war to Tennessee in February. There, on February 6th, the Union forced the Confederate contingent at Fort Henry to surrender. Faced with a combination of violence and the fort's poor location on the Tennessee River, nearly flooded by rising water levels, the fort's surrender opened the Tennessee River to Union ships. To the south, on the Alabama border, after the battle between February 6th and 12th, The Union carried out a series of raids using ironclad boats to destroy Confederate shipping and railroad bridges along the river. On February 16th, General Ulysses S. Grant captured Fort Donelson, another important landmark along the river. He would famously engrave the words, "Fort Donelson will here be marked in capital letters on the maps of our united country." Against this apparent reversal of fortunes compared to the opening rounds of the war, the Confederate States of America inaugurated Jefferson Davis as their president on February 22, 1862. More successes for the Union would follow in the next month. On March 7, 1862, more than 20,000 soldiers fought in the Battle of Pea Ridge, Missouri, which would prove to be the most crucial battle of the war west of the Mississippi River. Union forces, commanded by Brigadier General Samuel R. Curtis, advanced south from central Missouri, forcing Confederate forces into northwestern Arkansas. The Confederates counterattacked, hoping to recapture northern Arkansas and Missouri, but Curtis withstood the attack on the first day and forced them to retreat the next. Despite the Confederates' numerical superiority, the victory secured the state for the Union and allowed them to challenge Confederate forces in Arkansas. While the fighting on land resembled countless battles fought decades earlier and around the world, at sea and along North American rivers, the warships used by the Union and the Confederacy were conventional ships. In the midst of a great technological revolution, although sail was still the primary means of propulsion, it was quickly being supported by steam engines, which would have been used to keep a ship mobile even if the mast had been knocked down, which would have disabled ships that they depended only on candles. The power of steam allowed ships to leave their ports without dependence on a favorable wind. Just as revolutionary was the addition of new armor and weaponry to the ships. In the 1820s, navies adopted cannons that fired explosive shells instead of the conventional cannonball. The damage these weapons would cause to wooden vessels was immense, leading navies around the world to begin covering their ships with iron armor, giving rise to the term battleship. In the Crimean War, the French effectively utilized floating ironclad gun batteries that absorbed much punishment while silencing Russian forts. In 1856, they launched the first ironclad warship, the Glory. Work on an ironclad warship in the United States begun in 1854 was frequently postponed. After the Confederate States seceded, they began work on converting the old USS Merrimack into a battleship and renamed her the CSS Virginia. The Union, fearing the ship's potential damage, accelerated construction of its own, naming it the USS Monitor in response to Virginia. The Monitor did not look like any other ship of the time, having a hull that did not extend far out of the water, making the deck very wet in rough weather. The Monitor's most prominent feature was that it housed its main armament, a pair of 280mm cannons, in a rotating turret that gave it a wide arc of fire compared to conventional turrets. Former fixed guns, traditionally used on warships, finally completed, the USS Monitor was ready to enter the fight. On March 8, 1862, at the Battle of Rhodes in Virginia, the crew of the Union battleship learned that their Confederate counterpart had faced a Union blockade, sinking 2 Union ships and forcing the other, the USS Minnesota, to run aground. The next day, Virginia returned to finish the job, but to the Confederate surprise, the USS Monitor appeared and placed itself between Virginia and the stranded Minnesota. For the first time in history, 2 ironclad warships faced each other in combat. In the battle, the Monitor's turrets were damaged, but he escaped. The USS Monitor escaped with damage, forcing the crew to keep her moving and fire on Virginia when possible. After 2 hours of battle, both ships suffered damage that would have sunk either 10 years ago. Still, the combat took its toll, with the Monitor being briefly disabled while the Virginian captain was forced to admit that he did not have the weapons to sink the Union battleship. Both sides withdrew for repairs. The battle between the battleships was a significant first in the annals of naval history, but it was not the last, and efforts were underway in the Confederate States to unleash a new and potentially unbeatable weapon into the fight. Meanwhile, the war at sea continued, with both sides making efforts to disrupt the other's commercial shipping in an attempt to damage their economies, either by blockading their ports or hunting them down with armed warships. Back on land, the Union continued its advance into Tennessee after capturing Forts Donelson and Henry, leading to the Battle of Shiloh on April 6. Confederate General Albert Sidney Johnston, considered by many to be one of the South's most capable commanders, had regrouped a force of over 40,000 men in West Tennessee to face Union forces under the command of General Grant, who had over 60,000 men. Johnston was killed on the first day of the battle leading an attack against Grant's forces, being hit by a bullet behind the right knee due to the intensity of the gunfire. It was difficult to understand the situation. The general was shot, leading many to think that one of his own soldiers, firing at Union forces, might have accidentally hit him. He would be the highest-ranking Confederate officer to die in the war. The next day, Grant attacked again and overwhelmed the Confederates, forcing them to retreat and, in doing so, opening northern Mississippi to the Union. In April, finally, a Union war fleet, led by Admiral David Farragut, attacked Confederate forts at the mouth of the Mississippi River. Before heading to the Confederate city of New Orleans, Farragut demanded the city surrender, and on April 29 he, along with 250 Union Marines, removed the Louisiana state flag from City Hall. By May 2, New Orleans was declared recovered by the Union. In Virginia, the Confederates were successful against the Union when Confederate General Stonewall Jackson captured a Union garrison and its supplies at the Battle of Front Royal on May 23. 2 days later, Jackson's men encountered a smaller Union force under the command of Major General Nathaniel Banks at the First Battle of Winchester, forcing them to retreat across the Potomac River to Maryland. With Jackson on May 31, Confederate General Joseph E. Johnston attempted to dominate two Unions. After the battle ended, both sides declared victory, although in reality it was an inconclusive result that cost the lives of nearly 10,000 men. The battle for control of the vital Mississippi River saw another Union success when, on June 6, at the Battle of Memphis, a Union flotilla under the command of Commodore Charles Davis successfully defeated a Confederate flotilla, forcing Memphis to surrender. Consequently, the Mississippi came almost entirely under Union control, except for its westward course toward the city of Vicksburg. From June 25 to July 1, 1862, Confederate General Robert E. Lee and Lee's army, under the command of General George McClellan, attacked the Union Army of the Potomac in Virginia in a succession of battles remembered as the Battles of the 7 Days. These actions, Bronner Farm. Worried, Pope sent a force to annihilate Jackson's troops before being reinforced. Surprisingly, the two sides clashed near the Bronner Farm site. Although they suffered heavy casualties, the Confederates managed to repel Union attacks, inflicting significant losses. The next day, on August 29, 1862, the two armies met again in the Second Battle of Bull Run, or Second Manassas. Lee, reinforced by General James Longstreet's division, launched a decisive attack against Pope's forces, which were in disarray. The Confederates outnumbered the Union and achieved a strategic victory, forcing Pope to retreat once again toward Washington, D.C. The victory at Bull Run boosted the South's confidence as the Union faced significant challenges. The American Civil War would continue to test both sides in bloody, decisive clashes that would shape the nation's destiny. Battle of Bull Run, almost a year earlier. For 2 days, the opposing units fought, but Jackson's men managed to hold back the Union troops, setting the stage for retaliation. Under cover of darkness, the defeated Union Army retreated across Bull Run toward the safety of Washington and its defenses. This Confederate victory opened the way for the first invasion of the South from the North. For the Confederate cause, this could not have come at a better time. President Lincoln had already formulated the Emancipation Proclamation, which would free all slaves in the so-called rebel states as they returned to Union control. It just needed to be enacted. However, Lincoln's advisors now warned him against enacting it after Lee's victory. Even more problematic for the president was the upcoming midterm election, and he needed a reversal of fortunes soon to secure his position and enforce the proclamation. Aware of all this, Lee submitted Special Order 191 on September 9, which outlined his plan to attack Union forces in Maryland and Northern Virginia, dividing his force in two. However, 2 Union soldiers stumbled upon a sealed copy of these orders and delivered them to their commander, who passed them on to General McClellan. Aware of Lee's plan, McClellan's forces offered stiff resistance to the Confederates. On September 14, at Sharpsburg, prompting Lee to order his forces to regroup at nearby Antietam Creek. What followed was a bloodbath. After an intense morning fog lifted, Union troops attacked Lee's left flank. The tired and hungry Confederates put up a valiant fight but were overwhelmed, with 15,000 casualties suffered by both sides in just 8 hours. At dusk, this number, it had risen to 23,000, with 3,650 dead, making it the bloodiest day of the Civil War so far. The next day, Lee ordered his bloodied Confederates to withdraw south, back to Virginia, expecting McClellan to follow. However, McClellan remained in Maryland, much to the disappointment of Lincoln, who felt that the general had missed an opportunity to strike a crucial blow against the Confederates. However, Lincoln had his victory. On September 22nd, the Emancipation Proclamation was issued. Initially frustrated with McClellan's decision, Lincoln replaced him as commander of the Army of the Potomac with General Ambrose Burnside, who was pressured by Lincoln to adopt a more aggressive stance against Lee's forces. Burnside reluctantly accepted command and organized a force of 120,000 men to launch a two-pronged attack against Lee at Fredericksburg in eastern Virginia. Lee had only 88,000 men under his command when Burnside attacked, but the Confederates were well prepared and made good use of their defensive positions on the high ground. Burnside's force was subsequently defeated after the largest battle of the war, which re-energized the Confederates and devastated Union morale. It was a sad end to the year as the war entered its second year. Both sides were suffering from the pains of conflict. The Confederates, always outnumbered by the Union, had already promoted military recruitment to keep their numbers high. It was mainly the quality of their military leadership that allowed them to avoid being dominated. Now, having had its own numbers diminished by battle after battle, the Union introduced military conscription. However, the parameters for who should be drafted were not popular, as they seemed to focus on the poor and less qualified, many of whom were already struggling to make a living. Now, they were being taken from their families, who would have to find some way to cope without them. This began to inspire resentment toward the Union cause and the newly emancipated black communities in whose name the war was fought. The following month, on both the eastern and western fronts of the war, the Union continued the offensive by instigating a new campaign in Virginia against General Lee's army, still encamped at Fredericksburg. In the west, the Union Army moved to surround Vicksburg, Mississippi, in an effort to take the last Confederate stronghold on the Mississippi River. On April 30th, Lee, with 60,000 men, encountered 88,000 enemy troops positioned behind him, thanks to a march and river crossing, brilliantly executed by Union Major General Joseph Hooker. Hooker proclaimed, "Lee can either flee gloriously or do battle on our ground." But it would be Hooker who would end up costing the Union its victory. He had been destabilized by a series of intense counterattacks carried out by the Confederate rearguard and squandered his advantage by stopping to erect defenses against them. Despite his numerical superiority, Lee, alongside Stonewall Jackson, had time to plan and execute his own flanking maneuver in the following days. By May 6th, Hooker was forced to retreat, having lost 17,278 casualties to Lee's 12,826. It was a hollow victory for the Confederates, however, as during the fight Jackson was killed by Confederate troops who mistook him for a force of the Union. Lee wasted no time in seizing his victory, and he encouraged his men to advance north into Pennsylvania, but he also knew that his forces were in a precarious state. Food, ammunition, and horses to transport his army were all in short supply, and he counted on capturing what he needed from the enemy as he advanced. Upon learning of Lee's advance, General Hooker ordered a cavalry raid to attack the Confederates at Brandy Station. The Confederates resisted strongly, and the Union cavalry divided to attack bilaterally. However, thanks to a great redeployment of his troops, Confederate General J.B. Stuart managed to repel the Union cavalry. He then managed to save the city, and his army retreated. Later the same day, at the Battle of Second Winchester a week later, General Richard Ewell's Confederate troops defeated General Robert Milroy's Union forces, securing the Shenandoah Valley. The following month, the Confederates passed through York and reached the bridge over the Susquehanna River at Columbia, only to discover that Union militia had burned it, seriously slowing their advance. In Washington, D.C., there was fear that the Confederates would eventually reach the city, and so Lincoln, having once again lost faith in one of his commanders, this time General Hooker, replaced him with Major General George Gordon Meade. Meade quickly formed a force to pursue Lee's army, now in Pennsylvania and near Gettysburg. Upon arrival, the Confederates saw that a small Union force was already there and quickly drove it into retreat. On July 1st, however, it was the Confederates who failed to capitalize on this initial gain and did not pursue, allowing them to link up with Union reinforcements and strengthen their defensive line over the cemetery. The next day, Lee ordered an attack on the Union troops who were entrenched before him. However, the attack was poorly organized and it took hours for Confederate troops to engage the enemy. The Confederates advanced but were halted at nightfall after brutal fighting. The next day, the Union counterattacked, while Lee, mistakenly believing that his forces were on the brink of defeating the Union, ignored advice from his subordinates and ordered an attack across an open field that he believed would guarantee him victory. The Union troops, on the other hand, were well equipped, entrenched and protected by stone walls, and decimated the Confederate men. Realizing his mistake, Lee quickly scrambled to reorganize his men into a defensive line. He expected a Union attack on July 4th, which never occurred. Under darkness and heavy rain, he ordered his troops to withdraw under Union protection. Union casualties in the battle totaled 23,000, while the Confederates lost about 28,000 men, more than one-third of Lee's army. In terms of war debt, Gettysburg was the bloodiest battle of the entire Civil War. Things were already bad for the Confederates, and they got worse when Lee retreated from Gettysburg while being pursued by Union forces led by General Ulysses S. Grant. They accepted the surrender of the Confederate garrison at Vicksburg, thus securing the Mississippi River for the Union and denying a vital supply line to the Confederate states in the West. Such defeats meant that all of the Confederacy's hopes of receiving foreign recognition were dashed. And once again, there was a feeling in the air that the Confederacy would eventually fall to the Union. A week after Vicksburg fell, Union forces advanced into Northern Virginia, preparing and protect your forces. The escalation of violence and brutality continued, with both sides perpetrating atrocities against civilians and prisoners, further intensifying hatred and division between communities. Meanwhile, in the eastern theater of the war, fighting centered around Richmond, the Confederate capital, where the Union launched a series of campaigns to try to capture the city and weaken Confederate resistance. In the West, Union forces continued their strategy of controlling the Mississippi River, strengthening their strategic position by capturing key points along the river and cutting off Confederate supply lines. Naval warfare also played a crucial role, with frequent clashes between Union and Confederate ships often deciding control of important river routes and ports. As the conflict dragged into its third year, both sides faced enormous challenges. For the Union, it was the need to maintain its strength and morale while continuing to fight to preserve the Union and eventually abolish slavery. For the Confederacy, it was the fight for its own survival, facing growing military and economic pressure from the Union. These years were marked by bloody battles, strategic advances and retreats, and the growing human cost of the conflict. The American Civil War was far from over, and both sides were determined to fight to the end to achieve their goals and secure their vision of the future of the United States. During the Confederate pursuit, however, witnesses to Quantrill's men stated that no one managed to cross. The other Union soldiers retreated into the city. Quantrill instructed his men to fire on any Union troops or sympathizers, excluding women and children. However, Lawrence was no ordinary town. It had been the scene of brutal looting during the Kansas Blood War and was the home of a Union senator, General James Lane. In an orgy of murder and destruction, 75 men and boys were killed, while many homes were destroyed. Lane's house was ransacked, and several trophies he had brought from the South were recovered, but Lane was not present. This massacre outraged the Union, and Lane felt it personally. He took revenge by demolishing Southerners' homes and often killing the owners. East of Kansas, Tennessee, Union forces captured Knoxville and the vital railroad town of Chattanooga, through which about 50% of Confederate weapons passed, putting them in position to attack south into Georgia. Aware of this, the Confederates attempted to contain them, surrounding the city and its occupying force. Grant eventually took command there and organized a campaign to relieve the besieged city. On November 23rd, he led Union troops, reinforced the city and attacked and broke the Confederate lines, defeating the South. Along with Gettysburg, it was a key victory that began to turn the war in the Union's favor. While the siege was still ongoing in Virginia, General Lee attempted to outflank General Meade and force him into battle. However, this failed and resulted in a clash at Bristol Station on October 14th. The following month, Meade's Army of the Potomac advanced against Lee's army south of the Rapidan River. Lee quickly established a defensive line on the banks of Run Creek, and after several days of these new defenses, Meade retreated north of the Rapidan to enter his winter quarters, more or less ending major military engagements in the states for the rest of the year. General James Longstreet led Confederate troops in the siege of the city of Knoxville, controlled by Union forces commanded by General Ambrose Burnside, beginning on November 27th. Longstreet then attacked on November 30th, but was repulsed, suffering heavy losses in the process. Union reinforcements arrived in early December, forcing him to withdraw to Greenville, where his army spent the winter. As the year ended, President Lincoln issued a controversial proclamation. Any Confederate soldier who agreed to stop fighting and swear loyalty to the Union would be pardoned. He hoped this would inspire mass desertions from the South and hasten the end of the war, but despite all its setbacks, the Confederacy was far from finished. The arrival of the new year brought to Lincoln the prospect of elections near the end of the year. Despite the intense Civil War, democracy in the country was not suspended. Despite the conflict appearing in the Union's favor, the Confederacy still raided Union transportation with subversive tactics, damaging the Union's reputation. Lincoln needed good news from the war to keep morale high and prevent frustrations from being taken out on him and his party. For him to have any chance of a successful election campaign, fortunately, he didn't have to wait long for an inspirational story to arrive. On February 9th, after weeks of tunneling, 109 Union officers held prisoner in the notorious Lib prison made their bid for freedom, in which it would prove the greatest and most sensational escape from the war. The Confederacy launched a massive manhunt for the fugitives, eventually recapturing 48 of them and returning them to their prison. 2 fugitives later drowned, fleeing their pursuers, but 59 managed to get back to Union lines. Less than a week later, Union forces, under the command of General William T. Sherman, after a month of advancing through the center of the Mississippi, entered the city of Meridian and secured it for the Union. The city's capture was a massive blow to the Confederate war efforts. Being one of the most industrial in the Confederacy, the loss of war material produced and distributed by the city severely hampered the ability of the Confederate leadership to sustain its armies deep south and west of the Mississippi River. On February 17, 1864, the USS Housatonic, a 1,200-ton Union warship, was enforcing a blockade of Charleston, South Carolina, when lookouts spotted a strange object partially submerged beneath the water approaching the side of her ship. At around 8:45 p.m., they realized they were under attack from a submerged enemy ship and tried to bring their weapons to meet it, but to no avail. Shortly afterwards, the ship was rocked by an explosion. Just 5 minutes later, the 1,200-ton ship sank and in doing so became the first ship in history to be sunk by an enemy submarine. The submarine involved was the Alabama-built H.L. Hunley and was the latest in a series of efforts by the Confederate States of America to produce a reliable submarine. The bravery of the submarine commander, Lieutenant George E. Dixon, and his 7-man crew aboard cannot be overstated. The overestimation, as the Confederacy lost 21 men in previous tests of the submarine, during which it sank repeatedly, had to be repaired to proceed. The attack on the USS Housatonic was not actually the first Confederate attempt to sink a Union warship with a submarine, as another Confederate submarine, named David, had made an unsuccessful attack on the blockade of Charleston on October 5 the previous year. Despite their courage rewarded with a successful attack, Dixon and his men did not return to base. The wreck of the H.L. Hunley was found near that of the Housatonic. After the war, it would take many decades for submarine warfare to be perfected to the lethal and efficient levels of World War I and World War II, but it all started here with the H.L. Hunley and the Housatonic. On March 2, 1864, Union General Grant was promoted to the rank of Lieutenant General and became commander of all Union forces in the field. Most Union leaders believed the Confederacy was all but over. However, there were concerns about reports of around 25,000 French troops being sent to Mexico. It was feared that the Confederates would make a secret agreement with the French, and these troops would enter the war on the Confederate side. However, no such agreement has emerged. Many Union commanders felt that it was now necessary to force the Confederate soldiers into battle, where they would use up their remaining supplies and be overwhelmed by the superior numbers of Union forces. Grant planned to capture Mobile, Alabama, and the rest of the country to envelop the Confederate armies and force them into battle. Submission. However, Union General-in-Chief Henry W. Halleck proposed instead a military campaign along the Red River, involving Army and Navy units. The campaign had 4 objectives. First, to destroy General Taylor's Confederate Army. Second, capture Shreveport, Louisiana, and secure the Red River to the north, allowing the Union to occupy East Texas. Third, confiscate up to 100,000 bales of cotton from plantations along the Red River, further damaging the Confederate economy. Finally, Union forces would organize pro-Union state governments in the captured regions. The campaign began on March 10th, when a combined force consisting of Army and Marine units advanced along the river through Louisiana. On March 14th, they captured Fort Russie, seizing the only large-caliber Confederate cannon in the area. Meanwhile, the Navy breached a large raft placed across the river to block its advance. In light of these events, General Confederate Taylor retreated, effectively surrendering southern and central Louisiana to the Union. However, in the following days, the Union force began to lose its cohesion, with some units arriving late to their assigned areas, leading to clashes at times. Exalted among the commanders, Major General Nathaniel P. Banks commanded the Union Army, being ambitious and well-connected, which mainly provided him with his rank. Before the war, he had no formal military training. By 1864, his eyes were firmly set on challenging Lincoln for the presidency, and a major military victory would go a long way toward achieving that goal. Throughout the remainder of March, the Union advanced in pursuit of Taylor's retreating forces. On April 8th, Taylor decided it was time to make a stand and chose Mansfield as the site of the confrontation with Banks. Taylor gathered his forces at Sabine Cross Roads, knowing that reinforcements were nearby, while Banks' army was not yet fully assembled. Reports indicate that several Confederate reinforcements were freed Texan prisoners to expand Taylor's contingent in the subsequent battle. Banks's front line had collapsed, and the Confederates were now pursuing the Union before Banks' men could organize a new defensive line and achieve. Stopping them at the river, the Union Navy, under the command of Rear Admiral David Dixon Porter, also retreated upon learning of Banks' withdrawal, fearing that his fleet had no support on land. Commanders within the Union forces repeatedly found themselves at odds with one another through a combination of frustration and ego, and this severely inhibited their ability to function cohesively. This was an obstacle shared by both sides, as Taylor was equally frustrated with the lack of support from another Confederate general, namely Curb Smith. Meanwhile, Porter's fleet became blocked by a series of dams along the river, which focused his and Banks' attention as they tried to break through. After a nearly casualty-free engagement at Mansoura on May 16th, the parties battled again at Yellow Bayou on May 18th. The Union attacked the Confederates to try to block their pursuit. Union troops managed to repel the Confederates, only to have them counterattack again. Both sides advanced and retreated several times until the area around them caught fire, forcing a cessation of hostilities. The battle marked the end of the Red River Campaign, but it bought time for the Union to organize a withdrawal rather than lose an entire army to Banks. It marked the end of his military career, and the stigma of defeat would haunt him as he tried to regain his political aspirations elsewhere. The Confederates had additional successes, including the capture of Fort Pillow in Tennessee on April 12th. Confederate cavalry led by Nathan Bedford Forrest attacked and took the Union base, which included several black volunteers. The Confederate soldiers proceeded to murder them all, even though they had surrendered. In May 1864, Confederate General Lee had established a formidable series of defenses along his side of the Rapidan River in Virginia, aimed at containing Grant's forces on the opposite side, which were twice Lee's strength. Grant devised a major campaign against Lee's forces that would have 3 main objectives. First, Grant's forces would cross the Rapidan River below Lee's defenses and then turn toward the Confederate position. In conjunction with this attack, another Union army commanded by Major General Benjamin F. Butler was to advance across the James River to capture the Confederate capital of Richmond and surround Lee's position. A third Union force, under the command of Major General Franz Sigel, was to infiltrate south through the Shenandoah Valley to challenge Lee's left flank and disrupt his supply lines, so Lee would find himself without supplies and trapped in a three-pronged trap in which his army would be bled to death. The campaign began on May 4th, but on May 5th, Lee did the unexpected and, instead of fighting Grant's army defensively, launched an attack against the force that had crossed the Rapidan, leading to the so-called Battle of the Jungle. Advancing through forests and vegetation, both sides were largely denied the use of their cannons, and the fighting was short-range and savage. By May 7th, Grant decided to withdraw southeast, having repelled several Confederate attacks, to position his force between Lee and Richmond. The next day, Union troops launched an unsuccessful attack on Confederate troops at Laurel Hill, triggering the Long Battle of Spotsylvania. On May 10th, Grant began a series of attacks against Confederate defensive lines, culminating in a 15,000-man attack on the Confederate position known as Mule Shoe. On May 12th, the attack was initially successful, but the Confederate leadership regrouped and eventually repulsed this incursion. Union troops then attacked on the western edge of the Mule Shoe, which would later be remembered as the Bloody Angle, as it would involve nearly 24 hours of fierce hand-to-hand fighting. After the final attack on May 18th, the Union again achieved no results. The next day, the
Confederados lançaram uma missão de reconhecimento sob o comando do tenente-general Richard S. Evel em direção à Fazenda Harris, mas desta vez foram eles que sofreriam nas mãos dos defensores da União, e a força foi repelida. Em 21 de maio, Grant decidiu recuar mais uma vez para o sudeste e se preparar para o próximo grande confronto. A partir de 23 de maio, ambos os lados lutaram uma série de confrontos em menor escala ao longo do Rio Norton. As forças de Grant estabeleceram uma cabeça de ponte no rio e capturaram a ponte Chesterfield para contrapor o superior número de forças da União. Lee concebeu um plano para construir obras defensivas de terra, em forma de V que forçariam o exército da União a se dividir em dois. O plano parecia estar funcionando inicialmente, mas infelizmente os confederados não conseguiram aproveitar ao máximo essa vantagem porque Lee foi atingido por uma doença intestinal que o incapacitou, prejudicando a capacidade de liderança dos confederados de funcionar efetivamente. A batalha subsequente foi indecisa e Grant se realocou mais uma vez, desta vez em direção a Cold Harbor. Em 31 de maio, enquanto o exército de Grant mais uma vez contornava o flanco direito de Lee, a cavalaria da União tomou a encruzilhada de Old Cold Harbor, cerca de 16 quilômetros a nordeste da capital confederada de Richmond.
O Exército Confederado tentou retomar a crossroads, but fierce Union resistance caused them to hold out until reinforcements arrived on the night of June 1st. Fresh Union troops attacked the Confederate works west of the crossroads with some success. The next day, the remainder of both armies massed to face each other, the Confederates building even more fortifications and elaborate defensive positions that eventually stretched about 7 miles. 3 bodies of Union troops attacked the Confederates at the southern end of the line, but were easily repulsed with enormous casualties. Attempts to assault the northern end and southern side of the line failed. Grant said of the battle in his personal memoirs, "I have always regretted that the last assault on Cold Harbor was made. No advantage was gained to compensate for the heavy loss we suffered." The two armies fought fiercely over the next few days along the defensive line established by Lee, until on the night of June 12th, Grant once again relocated his men, marching them to the James River. It was a stunning defensive victory for Lee, but in a cruel twist, despite his victories against Grant in the Overland Campaign, his own losses were so proportionately high compared to the Union that the campaign was something of a defeat for the Confederacy. From St. Mary's Church on June 24th, Lee found himself retreating to the city of Petersburg, a vital city to Richmond that the Confederate general knew could be destroyed. It was a battle the Union could not win. There, Lee again constructed an extremely intricate series of defenses, including trenches designed to keep Grant's forces outside the city limits. Over the next few months, Grant would make numerous attempts to breach these defenses, which would meet with little success. Fearing a Confederate counterattack, Union armies built their own defensive lines, fortifications, and trenches to contain the Confederates. In the city, it was the beginning of the siege of Petersburg, which would last until the following year. The often static nature of trench warfare provided a grim portent of what was to come half a century later in Europe. On June 8th, Lincoln received his party's nomination for president in the upcoming election. 2 days later, a Confederate force defeated numerically superior Union troops at the Battle of Bryce's Crossroads in Mississippi. Then war arrived on Lincoln's doorstep in a surprising way. After defeating Union forces at the Battle of Monocacy in central Maryland on July 9, Confederate Major General Early pressed directly against Washington, D.C. The Union capital was quickly threatened. Early pressed his advantage and moved south toward the Union capital of Washington, District of Columbia, intending to sack it, hoping that this would seriously demoralize the Union side and re-energize the Confederacy. On July 11th, Early's tired force reached the outskirts of Washington, near Silver Spring, and began searching for vulnerabilities in the city's fortifications. At that time, the city was defended mainly by militias of elderly men and soldiers recovering from battle wounds. During the night, Union Army reinforcements, which had been surrounding Petersburg, were quickly redeployed onto transports to reinforce the city's defenses. On July 12th, Early attacked Fort Stevens, one of the positions in the Union defensive line north of the city, but his men were driven back by Grant's newly arrived veteran troops. In the afternoon, Union troops counterattacked and drove the Confederate invaders from their positions in front of Fort Stevens, an action personally observed by Lincoln, who watched from the forts and was directly targeted by a Confederate sniper. Realizing that he had missed the opportunity to take the city with the arrival of Grant's men, Early retreated to the Potomac. He reportedly told one of his staff officers, "Afterwards, we didn't take Washington, but we scared the hell out of Abe Lincoln." While Grant was fighting in Virginia, the Union was also carrying out another operation to the south with the aim of capturing the city of Atlanta, Georgia. Major General William Sherman invaded Georgia from Chattanooga, Tennessee, forcing the withdrawal of Confederate forces in May 1864. Sherman's forces pursued the Confederates, who resisted fiercely in skirmishes and battles throughout the summer. However, Union forces persisted, and on September 1st, Confederate troops stationed in Atlanta under the command of General John Hood were forced to abandon the city, allowing Sherman to march in and take it. It was yet another devastating blow for the Confederates, who were now fighting Union troops defending their prize. By November, Sherman had undertaken his famous March to the Sea. On November 15th, before Union troops